I need this morning a volunteer who will lead us in our opening prayer before our lesson. Is there someone here who's, okay. Tell me your name. Well, Michael Grants, pleased to meet you. Let's have a prayer. Amen. All right, this morning I want to introduce you to one of the tools that Truth for Today has for Bible classes. Now, I told you we have a comprehensive program, and it involves every aspect of the church worship and church service, and it includes this program which we've got the test results and everything. We've had them for a while. Bible classes that use these materials generate interest in the people who attend. They are exciting, and they're taught by, they have a little video clip at the beginning. This particular lesson is on the book of Acts. And I want to encourage you to take a look at this, not just for what it teaches us about the book of Acts, but also how effective it would be for your Bible classes. Men who are conducting a Bible class, I can tell you this has made my life simpler because it's organized and it's uber-organized. Dale Manor is a professor at Harding, or he's retired as well, but his specialty was archaeology. And so in the book of Acts, he brings in his focus, his talents, and his history of the Bible, and tells us what the book of Acts really does for us. Now, if I could get you to start the video clip. It'll be about 7 minutes, and then we will ask some questions that Dale Manor has proposed for us as part of this study. Now that's the PowerPoint.
When we consider the lands of the Bible, particularly the land of Israel, and I'll be referring to it as Israel and Canaan and Palestine, and use those basically synonymously here, it is a very, very small country. And it usually surprises people when they think in terms of how tiny this country actually is. A lot of people are oblivious to how little it is. It's about the same size as the When we consider the lands of the Bible, particularly the land of Israel, and I'll be referring to it as Israel and Canaan and Palestine, and use those basically synonymously here, It is a very, very small country. And it usually surprises people when they think in terms of how tiny this country actually is. A lot of people are oblivious to how little it is. It's about the same size as the state of New Jersey. However, as we go from a north-south orientation, from Dan to Beersheba, which is usually considered sort of the extreme population centers of ancient Israel, the distance as a crow flies is only about 150 miles. But this country has been the object of hundreds of invasions and battles, and numerous countries and empires have tromped through the country. As we look at the map, the black circle represents roughly where the land of Palestine is. This would be the land where Jesus lived and the beginning of the growth of the church. We may often ask, why did God put his people here? On a certain level, we can't really answer that question definitively. But there are a number of issues that come into play that make it fairly clear that he did have specifically a plan. If we go on the basis of the statement in Galatians, that God, in the fullness of time, brought forth his Son, or sent forth his Son, we have to understand that God is operating within the larger scheme of things. So I want to go through sort of a very quick survey of the various empires that, and I'm going to use the word tromped through the land of Canaan, the land of Palestine in Old Testament periods. First of those would be the Egyptians, who make their way from the land of Egypt up to a battle against the Hittites. But they have political control of quite a number of the places in the land of Canaan. We have evidence of this. But then the next group that comes through are the Syrians. The Old Testament talks about the Syrians and their threat, particularly to the northern kingdom of Israel. After the division of the empire, David is going to battle with the Syrians as well. And they leave an imprint, not as heavy as the Egyptians did at earlier times, but certainly there is an element of a cultural imposition to some degree on the northern kingdom of Israel in particular. Following the Syrians, we're going to have the Assyrians. Now, it's very important to remember that the Assyrians are different people than the Syrians. But the Assyrians come from northern Mesopotamia, and they are arguably the first major military political empire that comes into the scene. And they come down from the north, and they eventually are going to penetrate pretty deeply into the land of Egypt. The Assyrians, of course, eventually are defeated by the Babylonians, and they too then are going to come into the land of Canaan and leave an imprint, a cultural imposition, a cultural influence, a political influence. And of course, they take many of the people of ancient Israel into exile. As you look at this, you begin to see that this is a very significant crossroad of cultures. Another group that's going to come through are the Persians, as they make their way into Egypt, as well as into Turkey, and threaten the Greeks and so forth. They eventually will be defeated by the Greeks themselves, who make their way under the leadership of Alexander the Great, all the way over to the Indus Valley, but down into the land of Egypt, as they have left behind Greek and a lot of the philosophical ideas that characterize even our modern society. Eventually, of course, the Greeks are surpassed by the Romans, who come through and they conquer a much more large geographic region than did any of the predecessors that come into the scene. So as we look at this, in summary, we have a number of countries that have, with varying degrees of influence and power, had a significant influence and a presence in the land of Canaan. Elements of that cultural influence still remaining during the time when Jesus arrives. This is where God has put his people. And it's sort of ironic. It's an area very heavily susceptible to conquest, to other cultural influences, but the irony is that God's people maintain their political and religious identity, although they do apostatize a good bit, but they maintain their political and religious identity fairly well for hundreds of years. Now, as we look at this larger map, we're going to consider during the time of the Romans, the language issues that come into play. To the western end of the empire, roughly from slightly east of the land of Canaan and Palestine, all the way to Spain and to Britain, the two prevailing languages are Latin, which is, of course, the native language of the Romans, and Greek, which has become sort of the international language that Alexander the Great has managed to accomplish. On the eastern end of the empire, overlapping that area slightly from the west of Canaan and Palestine, going to the east toward the Mesopotamian region and even into what we would call modern Iran, the languages that have prevailed are Aramaic, which is a somewhat variation of Hebrew, and the other language, of course, is Greek. And it's interesting that at the crucifixion of Jesus, the gospel accounts point out that the accusation that is posted by Pilate over the head of Jesus is that this is the King of the Jews, and it's written in Greek and Aramaic or Hebrew and in Latin. And I don't think this is an accident, because God has placed his people with this Messiah who has come into the world very strategically at a location from which then the influence and preaching will go in all directions. And Jesus alludes to this when he says in Acts chapter 1, verse 8, "You shall be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in Judea and to Samaria and to the ends of the earth." I do believe that the geography plays significantly into this, and the Lord is going to use that as a means to spread the message of the gospel in all directions. And the book of Acts is going to trace the steps that are involved, although it's going to focus primarily upon Paul's missionary work as it goes to the west.
You know, Dr. Manner seems to think that God had a plan. My lesson this morning is stick to God's plan. That's for the sermon. Stick to God's plan. But I've heard people say, well, it was really unwise of God to put his people right in this corridor between all of these huge empires that would come in and conquer it, destroy it, raid it. And they argue that it would have been better for a serene gospel religion to be somewhat like Tibet, remote. They could focus on being pure. They wouldn't be conquered. What do you think? Now, I know that most of you have studied that. So tell me, should we go with the argument that the Israelites needed to be in some remote, secluded place? Or do we need to stick with God's plan? Tell me what you know about the book of Acts. This is your chat. Well, you led our prayer. Tell me your name again. Michael Brown. Okay, Michael, which do you think it should be? Did God make a mistake here? No. No, he doesn't. And I'm so grateful for that, because it gives me courage every morning. Thank you. God didn't make a mistake, did he? I asked a question that, of course, you know the answer to. You shook your head. What are you thinking?
I always think of God. Or it should. I guess it should. But sometimes we get to think we're smarter than he is. Saying something. So, to be correct, we always think.
I want to come over here just to emphasize how important that is. Everyone throughout Christian history and pre-Christian and biblical times thought they could change God's plan. Do we get, tell me, does anyone here have a driver's license? Okay, this is a little harder. Raise your hand if you have a license to change God's plan. That driver's license, even though it has your photo ID, doesn't allow you to do it. But we'll get to that later. Let's ask some more of Dr. That's, I always have trouble with his, Dr. Manner's descriptions here, questions. Let me read what he has written. I've reached that age when I have to have some glasses to help me out. Someone has said life is like putting your finger in a glass of water and pulling it out. The hole immediately covers over and it is as if your finger had never been in the water. You live and die, and then it is as if you had never lived. Wow, does that sound encouraging? Does that sound like dismal pessimism? Is this the way it was with Jesus? What remains of his life on earth? What did he leave behind? You can look around you in almost every city and see what a well-known retailer left behind, but what did Jesus leave behind? The book of Acts answers this question. So what did Jesus leave behind? Yes?
I wanted to go back to your first question. Being a foreign language teacher, of course, when he talked about the languages and the inscription on the cross, was very interesting to me. But how long was the Roman Empire? Wasn't it like 1,000 years? Roman
The
Empire?
Western Roman Empire, Rome was about 1,000 years from the Republic to the collapse in
Okay.
536 BC,
Okay.
of AD.
Okay. So, you know, that would mean that they were in power with their language for a long, long time. And so it seems that the coming of Christ was well timed, shooting towards a common language that would spread. The four languages that I know are all related to Latin, which would have been that language that was being spread by the Romans all over the Mediterranean and all the way up to the Hadrian Wall up in.
All the way to Britain, yeah. Have you thought about it? I'm sure you've all heard that sermon about at just the right time, God came, that Jesus came, and at the time, my wife points this out, thank you, there was a common language spoken all the way from India, or the far reaches of the east, and all the way to the far reaches of the Mediterranean, all the way to Spain. There was a language spoken, it was Greek. And the New Testament, what language is it in? It's in Koine Greek. There are some parts that have Aramaic, but for the most part, it's in Greek. We had a common language for the whole area. We kind of can understand that because English has become that language in the modern world. Other thoughts or comments from you about just the right time or just the right place? Mm-hmm.
People could move around faster. It was a time of peace. There was no war until AD 66 to 67. Things were peaceful, and that was not just a time that God chose that time. He said that.
He did, and we've got a expression in English. Maybe you can help us finish it. All roads lead to Rome, yes. Because the Romans, they did something spectacular. They built roads all over the empire. And I love the little Facebook page or site that says, okay, the Romans built these roads that still function today, and my city can't even fix the potholes. I don't think that's fair. But the Romans built great roads, and that really helped Paul when he went around preaching the gospel. If you think potholes are bad, you should see what the Romans had to work with to get their soldiers around. Okay, so we had this Mediterranean-wide transport system to bring the gospel to every corner. And did it work? It did. Even while Luke was writing, we already have recorded one Roman administrator saying, "You've turned the world upside down with this gospel." And wow, if you want dynamic, look at the first century church. Don't look to the second, third, fourth century church. It becomes less and less dynamic. But in the first century, they turned the world, I gotta do that again, upside down, because they had something exciting to share with the world. And we're not talking about just the Mediterranean Sea. We're looking all the way beyond Babylonia into the Indus Valley. The gospel was spreading all the way to India and beyond in the first century. What else do you know about the book of Acts? I'll ask a question. Does Acts move to an obvious conclusion? We're looking at the end of Acts. What happens at the end of Acts? This is a tough question because it's kind of unfinished, isn't it? We have Paul in prison. We don't know what's going to happen to Paul. 2 years later, after the book of Acts closes, Paul is martyred. So when Luke is writing, we don't know how this story is going to turn out. Now, the book of Acts continues what New Testament book that you know? I said the book of Acts. I might have misspoken. I do that a lot. The book of Acts continues what book of the New Testament? It would be Luke. We must award you the Genius of the Day award because you'd see it. He's looking around. No, that's exactly it. Luke wrote the Gospel of Luke. Was Luke an eyewitness to Jesus' life? He wasn't. But he wrote something that's so valuable that even secular scholars say, thank you for Luke. His Greek is, I don't know what we would call it, polished, yeah. And he does something that's unique to the Western world. He tries to write accurately. The great father of history was a Greek philosopher called Herodotus. He's the father of history. And Luke follows in his tradition of trying to tell the truth. This is in contrast to all of the Babylonian kings and the Assyrian kings. If you go and look at their monuments, their testimony about themselves, it's all exaggerated. They talk about how they crushed these enemies, they destroyed their cities, and scholars today are coming back and saying, well, actually, this is an exaggeration. He actually lost that battle, but he wrote on in his documents and his clay tablets, he wrote that he won. With the West, starting with the Greeks, we started trying to record history accurately. So can we rely on Luke for the accuracy of his gospel and of the book of Acts? Absolutely. And we've, secular scholars, their whole reason for looking at the Old Testament and New Testament is to find some way to disprove it. And for at least 300 years, they've been trying to disprove the accuracy of the Bible. Guess what they keep finding? Just go to any Christian website, and you'll see all of the proofs, and Dale Manor brings them in his lessons, all the proofs that the Bible is accurate. I'll give you just one example. It wasn't more than 150 years ago that archaeologists and scholars, even some at the university I attended in Germany, they argued that the Hittites don't exist, that the Old Testament made them up. And then in the late 1800s, early 1900s, they began discovering them. Oh, that thing's dangerous. They began discovering these monuments, these buildings, and things that they had no idea where they came from, who they belonged to, but they couldn't read the script. And then they found a document that had Greek, Egyptian, and this foreign language that turned out to be Hittite. And they just started discovering all of these marvelous cities that were Hittite. The scholars couldn't, because they hadn't had any proof, they couldn't believe. Could we turn this down just a little bit?
Like being married.
Oh, okay. It's gonna be tough, then. Can you hear me? I'll yell real loud. I'll have to remember. But I've got a pretty strong, booming voice. I'm the only one I know that ever got kicked out of the barbershop society for singing too loud. Okay, the archaeologists, the secular archaeologists, one minute. Oh, so we don't have to, okay. Well, then we are pretty close to finished. Just remember that Luke is accurate. His book of Acts is unfinished. We have to rely on history to tell us what happened to Paul. And now, if you have any last thoughts or comments, this is your chance. Tell me what you know about God's providence and plan for the book of Acts. What's that? Yeah. To be accurate today? Is that what you said?
Yes.
Absolutely. And we certainly can avoid the dilemma that Joseph Smith put upon his followers. There were some Egyptian papyri touring the early colony, early U.S., and those papyri were untranslatable because we couldn't read Egyptian. But then we found the Rosetta Stone, and we translated them. Unfortunately, Joseph Smith had already translated them as the book of, or the Pearl of Great Price, and it was a fictional, made up by him account of the history of God's people coming to the U.S., I believe, or to Mexico. When they were finally deciphered